Hi, and welcome to Rooftop Recordings Home Recording Series. Today we're going to be looking at the drum mixing of the complete drum setup that I might use for like a pop or a rock or country album, and the full kit and caboodle on drum mixing. So I've got a few things pulled up and done a little bit of prep work here so that I don't have to get too redundant on the individual and smaller drum miking, but I'm going to cover a lot of those things sort of briefly in passing. So we've got the session, which, as you may recall from earlier videos, double kick mic, double snare mic, rack, floor, crotch mic, hi-hat, overheads, and room. And I just want to start by playing the tracks as they set, unprocessed, unmixed, no time alignment. All right, so not bad. The very first thing that I would do mixing drums is make sure of the time alignment. And before you even get to mixing, during the production phase, you can do yourself a favor and have the drummer play individual hits. This can be useful for a lot of things that we're going to see as we move along. Kick, snare, toms. I like to get a loud, medium, soft hit on each of these. Loud, medium. I have every drum in that kit opened up, so you get the idea. One of the biggest benefits of this is I can take a look at, say, this snare drum hit right here, zoom in, and watch how the waveforms are lining up. Anytime these waveforms are not moving in the same direction at the same time, you've got cancellation happening. And for example, you can see the rack tom is moving down while the snare mic is moving up. And that's actually weakening the power of that snare hit. And this is mostly going to be heard on low frequency part of the drum tone, the fundamental power on the bottom. And on the first run through, that's something that I could hear was not exactly everything that I wanted it to be. So if we zoom in, the technique for this I've covered before, but just to briefly recap, I can look at the overhead mic here on the bottom. This bottom track is the overhead. And I can see there's a little offset between the two overhead mics about where the snare drum is hitting, but I'm going to go to the earliest transient on the overhead. Highlight that and look at the earliest transient of the snare. We've got 207 as the offset between those. So I'm going to delay this by 207 samples. In Pro Tools, you can do that here with the delay compensation, which if you don't have that in your way you've got your screen set up, you go to View, Mix Window, Views, and be sure that delay compensation is highlighted. If you don't have it highlighted, that window goes away. That's how you get there. And 207 for the snare top. The snare bottom, I've got a little less than that, 201. And on the snare drum specifically, I like to also time align the crotch mic on the snare hit as opposed to using any other hit. And that crotch mic, oops, get out of there. The crotch mic, we're currently looking at 167 for the crotch. And also the hi-hat. I will take the hi-hat on a snare hit as well, because any bleed coming into that hi-hat mic that's weakening the snare, I want to eliminate. I don't do that for everything, but these mics, I'm not going to time align the hi-hat itself or the crotch mic because everything is coming into that. It was placed sort of equidistant between each of the drums. I'm not going to time align the kick to the snare. I want the kick time aligned to the kick. Likewise with the tom mics. But the hat and the crotch and these other sort of ambient mics, I'm going to time align to the snare for power, and that is 56 samples. So I'm not going to take you through this on each of the drums. I've shown how to do it. You would repeat that same process with everything else throughout the whole kit. I already took these measurements, and I'm just going to plug them in to save a little bit of time, because you don't need to see me do that 4 times over or whatever it is. Floor tom. Yeah, okay. So now that everything's time aligned, it's instantly going to pick up more power, especially in the bottom end, the slam. Check this out. Definitely more power to the sound already. So the other thing that I hear is howl in the toms, and I've detailed this before as well. So I'm going to just do this really quickly. And Pro Tools has a feature called strip silence. You could put a gate onto these drums. There's some really good gate plugins out. There's a bunch of things you could do. I like to use strip silence and just literally erase that track anytime it's not being hit. So you just set a threshold, and then you can also dial in how long you want to give before the hit. And I want to be sure I've got plenty so that I don't miss an initial transient. And how long of a tail do you want at the end? I normally fade it out by the time the next drum hit comes in. So it varies on the tempo of the song, but you can see drum hits, and I'm going to stretch that out just past that next drum hit. There's a couple that are a little longer, so we'll go about 1300 milliseconds. And then I strip that out, Apple F, Command F, and I can see it. I've got 229, so I'm going to fade in for 200 milliseconds, and fade out will be something a little shorter than what my clip end pad is. And that should give me a pretty nice result of trimming down those tails. Another thing that I'll sometimes do is I can see this tail decaying away, and I'm going to leave most all of that decay in there. And don't want to go too long, but I don't want to go too short. So we'll take that out, strip, fade, and I lengthen that end pad. I'm going to lengthen the tail as well. And here's a section with a lot of fills. Let's see what we got happening there. Yeah, sounds nice and natural. If we solo those up. Oh. We got a bad tom hit. So one of the things that I like to do, you'll hear a lot of people give the advice that you shouldn't listen to your tracks in solo. I think this is not good advice for mixing. When I mix a track, especially when it's a track that I didn't record, and I should do this on my own as well, at some point in the mixing process, I'm going to listen to every track soloed all the way through. I want to make sure there's not some sort of defect or background noise that I don't intend in here. So I heard a noise on a floor tom hit, and I just want to make sure that all of these hits are good and clean. Those are good. Ooh, that's the bad one right there. Let's see how this last fill is. Okay, so we've got one bad hit, and we have samples. We made samples, which I've got nice and neatly cut out from my strip silence. That sample's pretty close to the one that we're replacing, so I'm going to take that sample, copy it, and this is the bad one. The thing I like in Pro Tools is if I drop this clip not where I want it to be, but somewhere in the vicinity, I can then watch the waveform as I drag it and make sure that it lines up right with what I'm replacing, which means it's going to stay phase coherent to the bleed, and it's just going to work better to keep it really well lined up. And I'm going to turn it up just a smidgen because the original hit was a little bit louder. And then with overheads in the crotch. Yeah, it works perfectly well as a replacement and facsimile of that original drum hit that had some distortion. So we got rid of that. And that's a great example of why it's important to listen to each of your tracks in solo when you're mixing, just to know exactly what you're dealing with and do everything you can to clean up each of the elements. So there we go. We've got the toms cleaned up, and now we won't have that howl. Great. So I've prepared a few treatments to each of these, and let's just quickly listen to these tracks in solo, and I'm going to show you what I did. Put some loop on here. We'll get a section going and loop it. Okay, I was not crazy about this kick drum sound. Turn this up a little bit. So I added some EQ with the Pro Q. I heard that resonance, and I just want to tuck it in a little bit, make sure that that's not getting in the way of the rest of the tone. And in addition to that, I took the EP5 4-band EQ and added a few things here. So if I boost it, you'll hear a lot of high-end, kind of clicky, thin sound in that. So I'm rolling that off. Just to soften up that top end. It's a kick drum. We don't need a lot of top end. But I am highlighting sort of the meat of the attack down where I want it. Sometimes this will be 3K. In this case, I like the 1.5K. It's a nice focused kick. Now, 500 range is really just like mid-range dirt. So we're going to scoop that out. And depending on how the bass guitar sits with it, I might add a little bit of low end. In this case, I don't really know. I'm going to leave it flat, but I might highlight it a little bit, give it a little more kick in the bottom. I do have this second kick mic, the out kick mic condenser. I'm pretty sure it was a 414 in this case. And that's getting a lot of nice low end. I did also add the fab filter, highlight a little more of that bottom end, and I notched out, oops, wrong one, sort of that dirty upper part of the low end. Just notch that down a little bit. That's going to leave in the mix more room for the bass guitar to come through. And then again with the API 550, similar thing, took off some of the extreme highs. I brought up a little higher, oops. A little higher element, getting some of that high end back in. I like the way it sounded on the out kick. And then in the snare top, again, notch filtering out some ring frequencies. That does leave it lacking a little bit of body on the bottom, but I put the Neve 1073, and there's plenty of bottom end at that 110 that I can dial in to make sure it's got enough power on the bottom. And that's also highlighting the crack. Bottom snare, I'm just doing a high pass filter to this. I don't need the kick drum bleed in that. I just want the rasp of those snare wires. Now, I might at a recording session hear that and want more of that and encourage the drummer to loosen up those snare wires to get a little wetter, longer ring out of those snares. You can't create it if it's not there. And I find many times those will be sort of over choked off. There's a drummer I work with, Don Dennison, who's got a really great Beyer snare drum that has a 3-position throw to really quickly dial that snare wire into just whatever you want. And it's not something to overlook. Like how tight those bottom snare wires are is a big part of the sound of the snare drum. And I like to have that bottom mic on to capture it and control how much of that we're getting in there. Toms, I didn't really hear anything wrong with those, the sound of those tom mics. They're great just as they are. Now, the crotch microphone is an interesting thing. We're going to come back to this in a minute. But the crotch mic is equidistant from all the drums and gets a little bit of all of it. Now, this I want to sort of just be a big, exploded, destroyed sort of thing to give some character and vibe to that drum track. So there's 2 things I did. I scooped out a little bit of mid-range. It's not a very hi-fi mic that I use for that. It's a 635A, an old EV sort of interview mic. And then I'm going to put an 11.676 on with 4 buttons, all 4 button ratios in, excuse me, and just smash it. And I play with the attack and release until I really get it breathing and really highlight the smack and slap on each of those drums. That's the kind of sound I want from it. The hi-hat, very often in mixing, I won't use hi-hat mics. Really, it's a provisional thing. Likewise with the ride mic, which I didn't put up in this case, but just if there's a little bit of defined work that the drummer's not playing as loud as what I would want in the mix, I can bring it up with the hi-hat mic. Very often I'll leave it off, or at most I may find these denser sections where it's actually being played and use those and then mute it out in other sections. But I found on my first playthrough, it just did not need this hi-hat. I'm going to unsolo this and play it and bring that mic up and down. And there I'm onto the ride. Coming back to the hat. It just doesn't need the extra definition, and it's more bleed to get in there, so I probably wouldn't use that. But if I did need more hat, it's there. I can crank it up, I can automate it, I can mute out everything except the sections I want. Now, the overheads and room mics, very often mixing, I'm treating those together. I use stereo overheads, stereo room mics. Some people will use a mono room mic, some people use a mono overhead with stereo rooms. And they give each a different sort of vibe. I'm going to play around with these, and first I'm going to show you what it sounds like with stereo and stereo. And I'm just going to solo these up and control them as a unit and sort of just set the blend between the two. Overhead alone first. Pretty direct and punchy. And that's pretty diffused and sort of background. All right, that to me sounds like a good blend between the two. I picked this place because I have a large garage that I've converted into my studio, and it's 24, 25, 28 feet by about the similar distance wide, 14 feet plus tall. So I have a really nice natural ambience, and when I mic that up, I may not need any other reverb. But let's hear how the whole kit sounds together, just mixed and leveled with the faders. A little bit of processing just to tweak what we've got. And I'm going to come back to this crotch mic and show you that too. Pretty good natural drum sound right there. Now the crotch mic, I hope you're watching this on your studio monitors or on some really great headphones. That's the best way to listen to any of these online recording videos. However, right now, I would like you to find your smartphone, go to your YouTube app, pull this up in your history, jump to this spot, and listen to this next playthrough. I'm going to start with the crotch mic off and bring it in. And we'll go back and forth a couple of times, and you can hear what this does. I like this crotch mic technique to make the drums really clear and audible and sort of energetic on those cheap playback devices. It's really useful for that. So here we go. Grab your smart device. All right, now I'm going to bring that crotch mic in. Now I'm going to take it back out. So in a mix, this is really going to help with getting those drums to punch forward and cut through on less fidelity sort of playback devices. And this is a part of the way people are listening to music. It's just important. Not that we have to change what we're doing, but it is a piece of the reality of music production now is that it will often be listened to on those sorts of devices. So we want to be sure it's going to sound good everywhere. So that's sort of what I would probably do for these drums in a natural sense. Now, there are two other very important techniques on drum treatment all in all. The first one is parallel compression. Some people call it New York style compression or a mash compression. That's how it was taught to me. And I've gone through this before in other videos, but just to review it. What we're going to do is take all of the drum tracks, and you actually don't have to do it to all of them. If you're really compressing your kick independently, you can leave it out of a parallel mix and do everything else and leave the kick drum straight. There's no one single way, but the way that I do it most times is I send everything by way of an aux send or a bus. And I'm going to set this bus up to my drum parallel compression bus. This is a preset that I leave in Pro Tools, named and labeled, and everything goes to it. Everything goes through it to it at unity gain. Everything goes to it following main pan and post fader, so that whatever I do down here for panning and whatever I do down here for level adjustment affects what's sending to that parallel. And then routed from there, it goes into an aux track, an aux input, returning from that same drum aux bus that we just set up. And there's a number of different compressors I might use. I really like the Neve 33609. I really like a Fairchild 660 or 670. Sometimes I really like the API 2500. I have some hardware pieces that I might use during mixing, routing it out to an output and sending it to hardware. DBX 160 sometimes, an 1176. But today we're going to use the 33609. It's got a real firm, aggressive compression that I like. So fast recovery, which is the release time, and pretty low threshold, pretty high ratio. So I want to be burying this a good degree. And I'm going to blend that. So we've got the uncompressed drums setting over here in the mix. And then we have this compression coming back next to it on another fader to be blended with it. So it's really supporting up the bottom. So this can be a pretty aggressive compressor. So you can hear as I bring it up. It's really adding energy and power underneath that drum set. I actually have to bring my output on my summing amp down a little bit here to let the whole impact of that come through. So in a mix, I'm probably going to use that lower. And the way I work this in a mix is I've got everything sounding like I want individually, sort of dealing with it. I got it at a good spot. Like right now, I'm pretty happy with where this whole kit sets. So I might group these or send these to a VCA and bring that whole kit up or down relative to the rest of the mix as a unit. Likewise, separately, I might bring that parallel compression up and down as a unit to decide where I want it in the final balance. Very often I find that keeping these just under unity gain and the parallel compression somewhere between -10 and -5 often works for me. There's no everything every time, but that's a pretty good spot to start. The other part of that, the other way that I might treat these drums, and again, no parallel compression here. Really bringing some energy and excitement to it. The next thing is reverb. And there are two schools of thought on reverb for drums. One would be to add reverb to your ambient microphones like the room mic or the overhead or both of them. The other is to put it on the individual type mics. And they do a different thing. So instead of just saying, this is the way I do it and this is the way you should do it, let's look at both of these options. So I've got the reverb send right now coming similarly, a post fader send and following the main pan. So I'm sending it pretty liberally to the verb, and I'm using, this is one that I often like. It's the Waves Abbey Road Chamber, and filtering a little bit of the drive into it, fairly short steed delay going into it, fairly long time in the room. I like the Altec speaker. It's a little grungier than the B&W, and the KM53s are the classic that Abbey Road always seemed to use in this chamber number 2. So I'm going to use that and bring it in on these ambient mics. So that type of a reverb on the ambient mics leaves the punch of the individual type mics and the individual drums quite clear. But it gives the space and air around the drums in a really nice way. Now, if I go the opposite route and put reverb on the crotch mic and the tom mics and the snare mic, or just the bottom snare, a lot of times really works nicely for that too. Maybe not quite as much on the kick, but only on the batter kick. And probably going to have to bring this level down because there's a lot more send from a much louder mic source going there. But let's hear how this sounds as a difference. So it's a subtle difference, but this to me sounds more processed. It sounds a little more synthetic. And if I was making a record for like a 80s new wavy sounding indie band or a band that's got more electronic elements, that may be a really cool way to go. Because it doesn't sound quite as natural. It sounds a little more messed with. And it just, it's all a matter of what you want to get out of the track. So for me, I like the ambient reverbs usually. I don't always add artificial reverb. My room sound is great, and that alone would probably cover the ambient sound of the drums for most tracks. But if I need it to be a little bigger, or if it was a ballad or something like that, then I very likely would start by trying to hear what it sounds like on the ambient mics. No verb, no parallel. Now, just as an option, let's take that reverb off and just bring the room mic up a little more. No room mic. So there you have it. A few different things to think about and a few different approaches to mixing the full drum set. Time alignment, parallel compression, listening and treating each drum track individually and making sure there aren't any flaws and problems. Develop an overall blend. Bring the faders up until the blend is working the way you want. Bring the parallel compression in. And of course, with all of this, listen to how it's balancing and playing with the rest of the instruments. Have some fun. Make the stuff sound the way that your ears imagine it and your brain wants to hear it. And if there's something else you'd like to see covered on this, maybe the acoustic treatment of the drums themselves or whatever, leave the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you later.